What's the biggest red flag you've ever seen in a job interview? Not during an interview, but during my time, it was a car dealership. I didn't care about the work, just needed to get paid. The managers understood and were cool about it. Promised me a service advisor position in the future, as it's more pay, but also more stress, which I didn't mind if the money reflected. I was in the BDC department, or bookings. 2 months in, I started to do a little bit of training as a service advisor. Just basics, checking car oil levels and driving it out, kind of like a porter. Coworkers loved me for my vibes I brought. Management loved me because I was efficient as hell and great with customers. And customers loved me as well because I cared. The lead service advisor, we're cool. Even let try my hand at selling brakes, and guess what? I did get that sale. My manager pulled me aside and told me after the tire season, he'll look to transition me to a service advisor trainee. Cool. I worked my ass off. During that time, we had a visit from our main headquarters from Paraguay. The sales department had a new hire who was Latino. He was helping translate and showed some interest in the service department. His English wasn't the best, and his customer service was not good either. Whatever. Fast forward to post-tire season. I'm here waiting for the announcement, and guess what? They made him a service advisor. That's when I realized maybe because he would have good ties with our Paraguay headquarters and it would look good on our department. I was bummed, but whatever, I couldn't care. I was happy for him. I thought they'd hire me as well. So I stuck around to see why they hired him and not me. His customer service was crap, telling pissed off customers to pretty much deal with it. And he's just doing his job. And he was late for a few shifts and even missed one of his shifts. During this time, the dealership offered me a false promotion. Pretty much they wanted to transfer me to a dying parts department and made a big deal out of it. But the catch, which they didn't tell me in the start, was the pay was the same. It's more responsibilities since the team is smaller, and I would be in probation again. After I took the position and in the 2 weeks transitioning period, the new service advisor decided to hand his 2 weeks without actually coming in, so I said duck this place and gave my 2 weeks. In the following days, and the parts manger was surprised. I was like, why you surprised? You all knew I didn't want to be in this department. I spent my last 2 weeks doing the least amount of work. I still completed my daily tasks, but never went above and beyond. Just listening to podcasts and watching YouTube videos. My coworkers started getting toxic and were talking crap behind my back and being condescending. My whole department was full of females. So yeah, imagine mean girls. I was like, y'all lucky I'm still helping and doing my task and not just not show up. I then find out a new girl we hired. She's cool with me, was also going to give her 2 weeks after I left. During this period, my parts manager was on vacay. When he came back, I had 2-3 days left to complete my 2 weeks. And he was surprised, so they literally lost 2 potential candidates for their service team, 2 people in the BDC department, and 2/3 of the parts department. And so they hired a bunch of people. I talked with the hire of the BDC, and they asked me how I liked it. And I was being honest about what they did, so I hope they're aware of the bullcrap involved in that place. Story gets good as I got a new job almost immediately doing what I loved and went to school for. And the biggest flex was for my training. The new company flew me to another country. While flying, I flew over the dealership, and I sent that footage to my friends from the dealership story too. Went in for an interview a little late in the day, 6-7 p.m. Most employees were still there. Workday started at 8 a.m. And as it was a startup, I thought it was possibly just overtime. Turned out it was salary, and not a big one. Went through multiple rounds of interviews. The red flag that I remember the most was the interview with the CEO. He kept checking his watch every 1-2 minutes the entire interview. It felt incessant and highly unprofessional. The interview went on for an hour, and it was close to 8 p.m. by the time we finished. I suspect there were no more scheduled interviews for the day. I ended up getting the job, stayed there for about a year. Absolute worst culture I've ever experienced. Workhorse mindset. Slave driving every day. When we first went remote during COVID, it was important to them, the owners, that we join a webcam call with the whole company, a sort of company happy hour at PAM. Mind you, I still always had 2 hours of work, calls, emails, etc. left at 5 p.m., but was expected to come in and contribute to a conversation that I'm not even paying attention to. It turns out my other coworkers who were in my position had put in their 2 weeks notice the same day I was interviewing with my current gig. The owners called me into a meeting to ask me to get ready to batten down the hatches and essentially charge forward into the abyss with them. I had to break the news that I also got a job offer that I couldn't turn down that day and that I would be giving my notice as well. The CEO didn't even spend 5 seconds to try to keep me on. I'll never forget his response. Well, it sounds like you have your mind made up. Please exit the call now. Within a year's time, they sold the company and laid off the entire engineering team that built the company from the ground up, who started out as interns, then being hired on and working in senior positions. architecting the entire system. They didn't get jack crap, even after all of those conversations about stock options, etc. Hindsight is 2020. If an interviewer/recruiter, especially the CEO, is more concerned about his watch time than the person sitting in front of them, you're likely just a number to them in the worst ways possible. Lessons learned. Story 3. Had to go in after 6 o'clock to interview, and most employees were still there. Start time was 8 a.m., ended up taking job, and worked 70-plus hour weeks until I left. Asked me to go in for interview on a Saturday. Another place had a piece of trash in the lobby, on the floor, that only if a candidate picked it up, they acted as an owner and would move on to next round. Story 4. More than 15 years ago, fresh out of law school, I started looking for my first real job. I had the degree, the ambition, but like many grads, no actual experience. And of course, every single company wanted at least a couple years. Where I was supposed to get that from, nobody could explain. Then I found a job posting that didn't require experience. A legal firm. Finally, I thought, a foot in the door. I showed up to the interview in a suit, ready to prove myself. 10 minutes in, I realized I wouldn't be doing much actual legal work. The job was to sell legal services. I'd be responding to inquiries from potential clients, not with full legal answers, but just enough to leave them needing more. The idea was to create just enough confusion to upsell a full consultation. Shady, for sure, but that wasn't even the worst part. At some point, the man interviewing, who I later realized was the owner, started yelling, not at me directly, but more like into the room. He said things like, "Why should I be paying you? You should be paying me to work here. You're lucky to even be sitting in this office." I looked around. There was an open space with a few employees already working there. Every single one of them froze. Some stared into their screens like they were trying to disappear. Others just glanced over it, and the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. Right then I knew, no matter how desperate I was for a job, this wasn't it. I smiled, said something like, "Wow, great conditions you've got here," and walked out. Sometimes, especially early in your career, the most important skill isn't your resume. It's knowing when to stand up, walk away, and not look back. Story 5. Made me wait in the lobby for 45 minutes. After I was hired, I was on the team that interviewed prospects. It was our VP's policy to make candidates wait to see how much they really wanted the job. It was a toxic place to work. I actually saw coworkers crying at their desk. I was pretty escort by that point in my career, so I was able to put up with their shenanigans until a plum offer came along. They had no clue why turnover was so high. Story 6. It was a reporting type of role. I thought it was more of a software development role. I was interviewed by the internal recruiter and then the person that would be my supervisor and potential colleague. I met with the recruiting person for a bit, and it was the typical overview of the company. It wraps up, the recruiter gets the other two guys. The guy that would be my boss came in and seemed super stressed and overworked. Off the bat, I just don't hit it off with him. The other guy seemed nice, and I think he would have been okay to have worked with. The boss asked the question of, two people come to me with 2 different reports, and they need to be done at the same date, and I only have time to do one. How would I handle it? I try to go with doing the report of the person that is the most important of the 2. That is rejected. I try to go with finishing up one report by the deadline and staying late to do the other one. That is also rejected. At this point, it was like being on a bad blind date where I sure and crap wouldn't go out with the person again. I was currently employed, and even though I had my issues with my current supervisor, I thought that they were better than this guy. I finally tell them that I'm not sure what I would do. The interview ends and they reach out to the recruiter. As we're waiting for the recruiter, I'm trying to make small talk. I comment on their outfits by saying, "Is the dress code here business casual?" The overstressed guy says, "There is nothing casual here." Needless to say, I didn't get the role, and I was extremely happy that wasn't the case. Story 7. 2 come to mind. One was an interview for the GM of a Deli Plus liquor store. Was told they intended to pay all roles minimum wage for the first 6 months to see what shook out. Second one, I had just moved to a new area, and the traffic took me by surprise. I called to let them know I was afraid I might be late and why. I wound up being 5 minutes early. When I arrived, they gave me a copy of the job description and uniform policy. No one working was following the policy I was reading. I waited 40 minutes for the interview to start. I believe, based on the behavior and statements of the interviewers, that this was punishment for being late, despite the fact that I was not late. Once I sat down for the interview, they asked me what role I had applied for, cook. They then asked me to recite my resume. When I started, they asked why I had not applied for a supervisory role. I told them I would have if it had been listed on their website to apply for. They interviewed me for the supervisory role going forward. After the interview, they explained that they could only base the wages on jobs they could verify, tall order and hospitality, and that I would likely be offered $50 above minimum wage. If I were offered the job, there was a kitchen test and 2 more sit-down interviews. I told them thank you, but I did not want to proceed with the interview process. They called me 8 times trying to get me to reconsider. One of the interviewers even went so far as to send my husband a message on Facebook, imploring him to get me to complete their interview process. Story 8. I was young, so I didn't really see the red flags initially. It was a startup the owner had just graduated from an Ivy League school. He was a trust fund baby, and Daddy had given him all the money for his new business. I was a temp employee, the only employee, and I asked my agency if they would talk to him and see if he would consider me as a permanent employee. This idiot decided that I had to interview like everybody else, although I'd been working for him for 3 months. So I scheduled a 45-minute meeting between him and I, there were no other employees, and said idiot proceeded to ask me 20 interview questions that he had written down on a notepad. I didn't get the job, somebody else did. She lasted a month and a half, and he tried to bring me back as a temp employee. Trust fund baby is in a business that has not recovered well since COVID in my HCOL area. In fact, that industry is still in crisis. No amount of family support or his vast network, due to his family, will help in his line of business right now, because it is an understood loss of money, a liability now, and projected as such in years to come. Story 9. Early in my career, I agreed to take a job in a different time zone, and everyone I talked with at the new position was astonished that I would do so. Nobody had ever relocated to take this position before. That was the red flag that I missed. It turned out that it was actually 2 half-time positions with the same job title, and there was zero possibility of one person filling both positions because it was a performing arts job supporting events in multiple venues that routinely took place concurrently, spread out across town. Literally physically impossible to do more than one at a time. They had an internal candidate grad student who took the other half of the position. Boss, who interviewed me, remotely obviously, completely failed to articulate this clearly in job posting, interview, or onboarding process. It was around week 3 that I finally said enough of the right things to clarify the situation. That was an awkward interchange. Topic of conversation was how weird the situation was and how amazing it was that I moved for this job. We're talking about an entry-level paying job in the performing arts. Instability is par for the course. Second in command, you knew this was a half-time job coming in, right? Me. No. The look of horror on her face was priceless. A few weeks later, boss interviewer went on long-term leave for mental health reasons. Second in command took over and things were much better. Thankfully, I was just out of university and able to live frugally enough to survive. But that was a heck of a situation to stumble into. After 1 season, academic year, I said, thanks, it's been fun, and moved back to my hometown in yet another time zone. Story 10. I was in a final round interview with Vice President of Marketing, would have been my manager, and the Vice President of Finance. Marketing Vice President was lovely. Millennial, mom of a couple kids, was trying to take the marketing department down a more analytical, data-based path. Finance Vice President was a boomer. Male, worked there for ages. I got along well with the Marketing Vice President. We had great conversations, and I felt it could be a really good fit. This company had a hard time attracting people with my background due to it being in the Midwest. Anyways, I noticed her body language shift as he entered the room, so I began to test that. I specifically asked her questions. She started to answer, and he cut her off every single time. I then asked about work-life balance, and she started to tell me how she has the flexibility to take her kids to school, then come into work, can leave and flex around appointments, etc. Finance guy then stepped in and just how to mention that they require that you work and come in on time/leave later, etc. The nail in the coffin, though. Finance guy asked me if I could build models. I said, what kind of models? And he just kept responding in Excel. Can you build models? Sir, I'm able to use Excel. If you can provide me with more details on what specific skill you would like to see, I can better answer your question and/or send examples. I called immediately after the interview just to remove myself from the pool. I knew that would not be a good fit for me. And I'm not sure how the marketing vice president stays at that company. Story 11. I once had an interview in a restaurant. It was outside of their opening hours, and when I arrived, the lights were off, the doors were closed. Not doors with a door, but those automatic sliding ones. No doorbell existing, and there was seemingly nobody inside. I called them a few times, got only voicemail, and sent them an email. After waiting for an hour without any response, I left. A few hours later, I got a rather annoyed-sounding email back. They said that it should have been absolutely obvious that the door was not locked, that I should have pried the sliding doors open to enter and walked to the back to find someone, and that it was very unprofessional of me to just leave. I never would have thought that breaking and entering was the obvious way to go. Story 12. A group interview with other candidates and work observation on an assigned project. I did it and realized I didn't like that kind of interview. Opted to never go to those kinds of interviews again. That company essentially got free labor from all of us and herdled us like cattle in a room, probed us with questions, then ended with a company project. I would encourage anyone to refrain from ever interviewing for a company that does this. They don't see you as a human, rather a competitive person who is willing to be a wolf that will work above and beyond for their company. I don't believe in overworking employees. Since then, I work for a huge corporation, and I am in an executive position. My department literally has a wait list because I believe in trust and integrity with my staff. My interviews are one-on-one. I set aside 90 minutes, 45 minutes, getting to know you, your work style, and then meeting everyone on the floor. Let's just say I have no turnover, and the only hiring I do is because of me needing to create new positions. With the approval of my company, I let my team set their own hours. Just need to guarantee 8 hours out of them. Some work split shifts throughout the days. Others choose to work nights or early morning. The only time we come together is for check-in on project status or team collaboration when we need to merge our work. That kind of group interview changed how I wanted to treat my team if I ever got into a leadership role. Story 13. I once went for an interview to a small restaurant. It was closed for public at that hour, 15 and 12 afternoon break, so it was empty. Owner sat me at a table, good 5 meters away from the bar, and proceeded to interview me from behind that bar. That was already awkward. As he did not want me to change seats or come to the bar, I tried to get up. He told me to stay there. But the worst? During the interview, he kept sprinkling in comments about 2 of his foreign employees, an Italian young man, an older Hispanic woman, that were working right behind him, cleaning glasses and stuff, calling them dumb and lazy and other mean names. At some point, he got so much into it that he went on a short rant about how much he hates working with foreigners because they are all completely stupid. I was young, so I just kept staring at him, stunned. I was a foreigner too, and he knew it. He had my resume in his hand, and at the start of the interview, asked me about my origin country. I genuinely had no idea what to tell him there. I wasn't as strong in my language skills yet, so I was doubting if I actually understand him correctly. Well, my partner at home then confirmed that yes, he was a massive git. I ended up not taking the offer I got from the owner. Funniest part was us finding later out that the owner too is a foreigner. Story 14. Boss said that he likes when people just get their work done and then leave. No time tracking required. That was in discussion for my position as well after my probation period. He also has a LinkedIn status. A profession is not a job, but a hobby. Works almost all day, every day. My superior, who started with me on the same day, took the bait and has no time tracking directly from the start. I ended up working 50 hours of overtime in my first 5 weeks, and he worked even more. But I could take the time off while his wasn't counted. And he gets so overloaded that 10-hour days are normal for him, although he has a 40-HR contract. Then they promised me a team of 8, after 4 new hires planned, working in 4 shifts to cover the production. Now I have 3 and we have to cover them nonetheless. Have to rotate being on call 24/7 weekly. Healthcare doesn't matter at all. I got sick at the beginning of February and still haven't recovered, because as soon as I start to work again, partially recovered, it starts all over again because of really bad air. My colleague joined a month ago and has nosebleed every morning. Also, there are no fire alarms in the production area. We are a foundry and would have the firefighters in-house at least twice a week because of constant smoke and occasional fires. I still have 2 months of probation left and absolutely plan to leave before that time runs out. Story 15. I once was called by a talent acquisition specialist for the company looking to hire. They essentially had a recruiter on staff. I did the phone interview and she felt like I was a strong candidate. The manager I was supposed to interview with had an emergency that morning, so I spoke in person with the recruiter and then the HR manager. Finally, they brought a maintenance manager in. I was applying for a production supervisor role. He looks through my resume and asked what experience I had, and I confirmed what was on the resume. He was obviously overwhelmed and didn't want to be there. After 15 minutes of questioning my experience and why it didn't correlate to what they do, he asked me to convince him why he should recommend me for the position. Before I could even answer, he goes on a rant about seeing on my application that I didn't prefer to work weekends, was posted a primary MF role. He claims they've not had a Saturday off in over a year. At this point, I just told him that apparently this isn't going to work. He got upset that I'd have applied for this position in the first place, which I reminded him they in fact found my resume and contacted me. I landed a much better paying role the next month and worked only a handful of weekends in 4 years. Story 16. This happened ages ago. I had applied to be a car salesperson. It was a job until something better came along. In-person interview, he brought me and a guy in to do the interview together. He asked no questions of us, he just sat there and berated us for 30 minutes. The guy got it worse because he wasn't dressed appropriately for an interview. He actually was, especially for a guy who looked like he just graduated high school 5 minutes before the interview, but this idiot thought he should be in a tailored 3-piece suit. Neither of us could afford clothes like that. The outfit I had on came from Kmart. And the guy was dressed exactly like the salespeople we could see on the floor. This was a Friday. He told us both to be there Monday for training. I explained I was currently employed and needed to give notice. He reiterated training started on Monday. Needless to say, I stuck with the job I already had. I figured if that was how they treated candidates, I didn't want to know how they treated employees. Story 17. Once I applied for a job, and during the first meeting, the interviewer told me I would have to complete an evaluation form. He stressed how everyone in the company completed it before being hired, and it was a requirement. Non-negotiable, to be completed within something like the next 3 days, maybe a week. I was like, cool, fine, no big deal. I got the form, and it's high-level analysis work, and long. For context, I am a data analyst. I am perfectly capable of doing that level of work, and I do it regularly for my current job. Not with this place, if you were wondering. But this would take me hours. They were not simple questions, and I wasn't being paid for any of this. And there also felt like there was something off about the questions, like it was a current project they were working on and they were trying to get free ideas, rather than a standard dummy evaluation. And I know they were paying a lot more than I currently make. But if they had this little respect for my, and supposedly everyone else's, time during the interview process, what the hell was it like once you got hired? I closed the evaluation and never opened it again. I like to think I dodged a bullet. Story 18. Interviewer asked me why I am the way that I am after one of my responses. I answered. They asked, but why? And it was clear this person was not interested in my skills, but examining me like a specimen. Was desperate and ended up taking the job offer I really didn't think I'd get. Turned out to be a horrifically manipulative, invasive, toxic office. Go figure. Story 19. I once had an interview for a utility bill comparison company. I was desperate for a job at the time. I went to the interview, brought a printer CV for reference, wore my only good suit. They handed me some forms to fill in with info. Glass walls so I can see the offices from where I'm sat. 20 minutes after the interview start time, still waiting to be interviewed. It starts before the 30 minutes mark. I get an apology for the delay. I'd seen the same guy get up and grab coffee a while earlier. I get the spiel about the company. We do the questions. It seems okay until the end. I ask about the pay as it wasn't in the advert. Turns out it's about $1 lower than minimum wage, with the rest being made up in commission. I point out that the role I applied for doesn't have commission available, support rather than sales. The manager gives the, we all started on this rate bit. I pulled out my phone, Google the national minimum wage at the time, then calculate how much they offering was below that, and point out that it's illegal. Asked for my form back, ripped it up and told them to stop wasting people's time. Never reported them. Really should have done though. Story 20. I will preface this by saying that I was young and foolish and really needed a job. Went to an interview and got there early. I proceeded to wait for 30 minutes over the start time. I kept thinking that it was some kind of test on their part to see if I would stay or leave. It wasn't. I eventually stood up and the receptionist worriedly ushered me back and reassured me that the manager wouldn't be much longer. I ended up waiting a total of 2 hours for a 15-minute interview, and all the while I could hear the manager in his office going bat crap and literally screaming at someone over the phone, and periodically at the receptionist who was trying to damage control. He was red in the face and so rude by the time I was finally let in to be interviewed. No apology from him. They offered me the job and I took it. I lasted 6 months. The guy was an absolute nutcase. Apparently, we are like family here meant I get to treat you the same way I abuse my own family at home. Story 21. I once had an interview with an oil and gas company and everything seemed good, but it was too good to be true. I noticed he was building it up towards a big question that he seemed hesitant to ask. He finally asked, how well do you get along with others? I knew what he meant by it, but I played stupid and just said I get along with anybody. He proceeded to ask me, well, how do you get along with other races? I replied, I just said I get along with anybody. The interviewer went into details saying, do you get along with black people, white people, and Hispanic people? I said anybody as long as they work and pick up their own weight. I can get along with anybody. He informed me that if they hire a certain person of race, and we stick them with another race of people to work with, they tend to not get along and tend to stick and want to only work with their race. At this point, I was like, what kind of crap show do they got going on here? I made up my mind right there and then and said, this is not the company for me. Story 22. Some people in the hiring department didn't like the interviewing committee, so they set up their own parallel interview committee to interview the applicants. Another time in another place, the hiring department couldn't decide what area to hire in, but they still interviewed people. They advised the applicants, we can't make up our mind whether we want to hire in Area A or Area B. We see you're in Area A. You'd be an applicant if we decide to hire in Area A. We won't know whether we can ever figure out what area we want to hire in. They flew multiple people across the country for lengthy multi-day interviews. They ended up hiring nobody. Hi, you're a finalist for our position. We have to tell you that we lost a lawsuit, and the reason we have to tell you is... Story 23. They stopped the online interview recording to tell me that what they were trying to say in a roundabout way is that they do not hire fat or lazy people. I was completely shell-shocked. I was incredibly surprised when they offered me the job, but also with a salary less than they were advertising for. I declined. Story 24. Not an interview, but I didn't apply for this well-paying job that I qualified for because this was in the job posting. The formatting is the same too. Not only ridiculous, but also poor formatting. Disqualifiers do not apply if you don't use construction tech platforms. If you're not leveraging modern tools, you're already behind. You can't enforce deadlines with trades. No timeline control, no job. You don't update schedules daily. If you check in weekly, this isn't for you. You want work-life balance. We're scaling at warp speed. You have distractions, no side gigs, no drama. 100% focus required. You won't live on-site or within 30 minutes. You must be in the action. You're not a rapid execution guy, slow, hesitant, not happening. You don't like Elon Musk. If efficiency, speed, and pressure sound miserable, look elsewhere. You can't be succinct, get to the point, fast. You don't document everything. No records, no role. Story 25. I will name the company. Epic. They have you take a proctored test that has nothing to do with it, and it's proctored by some person in India. If you check job interviews, they will tell you they will ask if you plan to get a master's degree and to answer no, otherwise they will drop you. Along with a few other questions, sure enough, every question asked. There was also another company, HR interview. Salary range they had posted on the job description was different from the salary range they were offering on the phone call. The HR questions didn't align with the job description. I finally asked him about it, and he got really defensive, saying they are looking for go-getters and people who will do more than the job description. Screw your Marsh and McLennan. You clearly are crap at hiring people, and your recruiters suck. 100% would expect him to be one of those who make you go through interview rounds to then say, well, the job isn't remote anymore, hoping you do the sunk cost fallacy in the interview to join them. Story 26. I was a new grad, got an interview for a job, booked the date, and came down at the appropriate time. I waited 2 hours to be interviewed. Part of the problem was that they had no one available to interview me. They were all on the floor. I then was interviewed by the first employee who went on break, who was handed a bunch of questions. She skipped all the questions and skipped out of the fact that this was a tough job that needed tough people and that I didn't seem tough. I would have left, but that egged me on. I took the job, had to sign an NDA, had to sign an agreement that there was no long-term or short-term insurance for injuries. Over the 2 weeks I worked there, people were injured left, right, and center. They told me I would have proper safety training before being put on a certain team. They didn't provide the training and put me on the team. I watched 3 team members be carried out by EMS that day. I put in my resignation letter the next morning. Story 27. Not a formal interview, but years ago, I worked for a large company with a 30K employees locally. I had a good reputation and would be poached for a new position a few times a year. One time I received an invite to chat with the head of neurosurgery. The guy seemed fine at first, was personable, gave me the tour of the department facilities, etc. We get back to his office and sit down, and he asks if I would like any water, coffee, tea, etc. I say sure. He says his secretary can bring it to us, then proceeds to make a comment, something about, let's see if she can even manage this task. It's no wonder these are the types of jobs women get and can hardly not screw up. Then he started telling me how the boys get together to play golf on the weekends a couple times a month and ask how my swing is. I was polite and finished the talk, but the guy was real surprised and offended when he followed up with me the next week, and I declined any interest. Story 28. Applied at an assisted living facility a few years ago. Checked in with the front desk. Said the supervisor will be with me in a bit. After 10 minutes, I went up to the receptionist and asked her if she can find out where the supervisor is. She asked me to wait 5 minutes while she calls up the supervisor. Supervisor apparently forgot she had an interview and did not remember scheduling me, even though we had spoken 3 days ago. I noped out of there. I've had many interviews where the interviewer called me by the wrong name, including phone interviews too. So my other names are Cassie, Caitlin, Keandra, and my personal favorite, Michelle Major Red Flag. If they cannot even remember who you are interviewing in the first place. I applied for a vet receptionist job and everything sounded good, until they mentioned the pay, which was significantly lower than what was shown. When I asked him about the original job posting, he told me, oh, I put that rate so that more people would apply, and chuckled. I also noped out of there. Story 29. I was interviewing at a restaurant bar to be a 4 staff member. The owners were a couple, the husband was a chef, and the wife ran for, but had no experience. The entire interview was her rambling about things she doesn't want in her employees and huge red flags. She didn't want employees that were, too experienced on the bar. She didn't like it when employees tried to explain how to pour a beer to her. Her husband taught her, and that's how she wants it done. There was no bartender, but they had wood. So if someone sat at the bar, Whatever server was around would deal with them. But then they would have to walk away and deal with their tables, leaving the bar unattended. She refused to let staff smoke, which is impossible in the industry, or have a drink in the restaurant after their shift close on their days off. Her college-aged kids were her for supervisors, 18 to 21-year-olds with no other experience. That's when I officially noped the duck out. Apparently, the place is still open. Story 30. I had two in the same interview for a skilled nursing facility. First was when he told me that they don't substances test and don't care what I do outside of work. Just don't come to work high or drunk. Second was when I signed my name and put my credentials after my name, because legally I'm supposed to. And he said, "Ugh, you do that too?" I thought that was so irritating when Julie, who I was replacing, used to do that. I was like, okay, and didn't know what to say. I should have walked out and not taken the job. The owner of the skilled nursing facility ended up being a cokehead who mismanaged funds, couldn't pay sometimes, and hired the worst employees. He put his homes up for collateral and lost everything. And this is healthcare. I quit. It got shut down and has reopened under a different name, but some of the same losers still work there. Never put your loved ones in one of those places long term and go visit every day to keep an eye on them. Story 31. I have a friend that's a CEO. We're both mid-30s. He set me up with his vice president of sales, who is probably mid-60s, for an interview. Dude shows up to the interview in a t-shirt and then proceeds to stonewall me the whole time. I'm a very friendly lady. Most people seem to really vibe with my fake work personality, and I can get them to engage easily because, hello, I am in sales. This guy gives me nothing. The interview probably lasted 8 minutes. I knew about 1 minute in that I never had a chance with this guy. About a year later, I hear his name come up during some industry gossip, and my mid-50s male former colleague and current friend mentor just completely goes off about what an a-hole this guy is. He didn't know that I had interviewed with him. This was a completely separate telling of what an idiot he is. And he also told me about how everyone at their level in sales in our industry also thinks he's an idiot. So, bullet dodged. Story 32. Went into for an interview at a car dealership. The person I was there to talk with comes up to me saying, "What's up, Ilbra?" We sat down and he then looked at the hand sanitizer that was on his desk, grabs it, and places it in front of me and said, "Sell me this." So I gave the most half-assed sales pitch for duck and hand sanitizer, and he tells me, "You aren't bad G, but you made a mistake. You never asked me if I wanted the hand sanitizer." I was literally the Pikachu meme face, dumbfounded. The guy even takes a call mid-interview, as if it can't get more awkward. The subject of the call was someone notifying him of the passing of some lady that may or may not be his auntie. Then, to top it off, he tries to sell me on the idea of a day off. 1 day off. Working 6 days a week, 10-hour shifts. Yeah, everything was a big red flag for me to say the least. Story 33. I applied for a compliance officer position at a home health company. The company had only been around for a few years and had positive remarks, so I said, hey, why not? So, interview day comes, and I enter the most rundown office, and I'm told, "Be with you in a second." I'm ignored completely. 20 minutes go by, and I start putting on my coat. The guy finally comes up and says he's ready. So, we get into a conference room, and this guy says, "I don't really know anything about healthcare compliance, so I Googled questions to ask you." Every single response I give, he counters with, "Oh, we're not doing that here. What are you doing, sir?" I start delving into laws and regulations surrounding home health, the need for policies and procedures, safety checklists, up-to-date CPR certifications, etc. The entire time, he had no idea what I was talking about. The director? Even worse. They're running the business into dangerous territory. I walked out of that interview and blocked the number. Story 34. Working for the government with a limited time contract and got the offer to extend another year in a different department. Interview with the department leader in which he obviously assumes that I already agreed to the new position. When it comes to things I should know, he declares they have their weekly team meeting actually twice per week. Monday mornings at 9 a.m. in person, and Thursday, 9:15 a.m., but as he was a generous person, that one would be available for digital presence. I took a deep breath and told him that I would consider his offer. Lie. When he started mumbling about Monday 9 a.m., my mind was already out the door. He then became surprisingly angry and said that it was news to him that limited contractors would get a say in which position they was offered to them. And for a moment, I got a glimpse of how it feels to be someone's property. But I know people who don't allow themselves to say no in these kinds of situations because they think their career depends on it. Story 35. Went to interview at position in a shop. Owner was an older gentleman in his 70s, likely slowing down big time in the near future. There were many red flags. First, he straight up told me that while he had no plans to sell his business, he also had no children or direct heirs to take over when he decided it was time to retire, and also no real plan in place for the business when that time came. Then, he made it abundantly clear that he was an absentee owner, yet if he found out his staff wasn't doing things his way, then he had no problem firing them. Lastly, at the end of the interview, He told me he had bought one of his employees a Tesla to commute in because they had a long commute. He then offered to buy me one right then and there if I took the job. This was last year, and I walked out on that interview after hearing that pitch. Dodged many a bullet. Story 36. I applied at 11 a.m., got a call at 1 p.m., interview scheduled for the next day. The interview itself. As a heads up, we are looking to fill this position ASAP. We are probably going to hire you. Just have to ask a few questions. None of those questions seemed to know much about data analytics. How was the job? Well, within a month, the guy that hired me quit, and he was not replaced for 6 months. His bosses also quit. Oh, and their closest, it was 6 hours away, BTW. They quit about 8 months in. I didn't get my own username or password. The tools were already set up, and I'm pretty sure that no one knew the username password, so if we stopped using those tools, we'd have no access to any data at all. About 9 months in, they asked me what I did there, and I had no answer. I legit just talked to my coworkers and drank Monsters all day. That's it. Story 37, not really a job. But in my early 20s, I was thinking about joining the Air Force. So I scheduled an appointment to meet with a recruiter. It was like a 3-hour drive for me to get there and 3 hours to get back. He missed the meeting 3 times, wasted 18 of my hours. Eventually, we met and etc. I went to MEPs, but by that point, I was pretty over the idea. So I asked my friend in the military if I could still drop out. He told me to just not show up for my reporting date and that there was nothing they could do about it. The recruiter spam called my parents, making up all kinds of bullcrap threats, saying I would get arrested if I didn't show up, and that he'd make sure I got in trouble, and that he'd make sure I was never eligible for a government job. Turned me off of the military completely. Story 38. I was recommended for a position that sounded pretty interesting to me, so I agreed to a call. They wanted to give me the job on the spot in that first call. I had to insist on, them to do further rounds, especially one in which I met the team I would be directing. They were nice and amicable, and after one more round on a Tuesday, where they wanted me to quit my job and start right away on a Friday, even if it meant wink lying to my current job, I said no can do, and I was still dead set on meeting the team first. They set up the call with the team, canceled it 30 minutes before said call, and never heard from them again. It really was an interesting position, so too bad it was absolutely the right choice to not get involved, and I was glad I stuck to my gun. Story 39. Manufacturing engineer position. Automotive industry. They brought all the other engineers in to interview me, and they all looked like they were half dead. One even asked how I felt about getting calls at 2 a.m. because some piece of equipment went down. He straight up told me it happens 2-3 times a week, including weekends. Of course, there is no or on-call pay for salaried engineers. At that point, I already knew it was going to be a hard no, but I continued the interview because I wanted to see what my market value was. The manager took me out on the floor to see the operation, and I swear that place felt cursed. There were almost no operators, and the ones working looked like miserable zombies. The place was poorly lit, a mess, and dirty. In the end, they offered me like $5K more than I was making at my one-shift 7:30–4:30 job. Story 40. I can speak as someone who did interviews. I had one applicant who was not aware that I was the interviewer. She came in and started rattling off about how she's the best dog groomer and she has years of experience. I didn't even get a chance to speak or introduce that I was interviewing her. I finally had a chance to explain the role she was interested in, and she cut me off and started going for minutes about experience that had nothing to do with what I said. She wasn't hired. I gave the benefit of the doubt the first 5 minutes. Nerves are normal. But she had not read the position she applied for, obviously, and was rude during the entire process. I don't think she knew who I was to this day, and if that's how you would treat a potential coworker, I wouldn't want the energy around my staff or animals. Story 41. I had an interview for a program that had rotating schedules every 3 months that included day shifts, 7–4–9–6, as well as late shifts, 12–9–1–10. When I asked the manager for the role if those late shifts were sporadic or typically allowed for days off, he shakily replied, well, like you were explained, the shifts rotate every 3 months. That means you get a day shift, then 3 months later a late shift, then a day shift again, etc. I would hope that's something you can understand. Manager already classifying basic questions as not understanding? Thanks, but no thanks, dude. I left the interview then and there. Story 42. I had a guy on the phone tell me he doesn't like to just hand out 6-figure salaries after he called me for a job advertisement they had which said $100K a year plus salary. The salary started at $60K and the rest was commission. The owner of the company literally didn't know what salary meant. When I tried to explain to him that's a $60K salary plus commission, he literally told me I was wrong and changed the subject, then asked if I wanted to interview. I told him I would interview at 8 a.m. the next day just because I wanted to inconvenience him and didn't show up because he was such a D-bag on the phone with me. He called me at 8:15 saying I was late. I told him a start time doesn't actually mean the time you start at. He finally caught on and hung up. Story 43. I interviewed at an adult daycare after I graduated and was a new social worker. This was about 8 years ago. The place said, well, we get our hands dirty here. If dishes need to be done, garbage taken out, people driven back and forth, etc. We're a family. The pay is $13 for a licensed social worker here. That's good money for getting into medical. This was for an office social worker job that was more on planning, not labor. Very sketchy vibe for that medical adult daycare, located in County NJ. I didn't take the job, thankfully, and was offered a hospital social work job a few months later with much better pay. The last I checked, they were still looking for a social worker to fill the spot. I signed up for a job listing board and I'm still on it several years later. Story 44. Had an interview recently where she was breaking it up into 6 parts on 6 different days. I was required to take a personality and IQ test. I wasn't opposed to this part, but the part where she grilled me about my answers for days and days. Then during the last round, she made me begin at 5 and tell her my whole life story, including whether I was bullied in high school and why. She also became very weird about me having a husband, especially when I told her he was an engineer that makes pretty decent. This is 100% true. I even recorded these interviews, the job working as a secretary in a real estate office. I took a different, better paying job that actually works better with my schedule. I'm completing my degree at my local state college ATM. Story 45. Showed up on site for an interview. There was a recruiter there that gave me a friendly greeting. Then the guy that was supposed to be interviewing me walked right up to the recruiter, not acknowledging my presence at all, and told her, "This isn't going to work. We need to reschedule." Then turned around and left, leaving the recruiter to apologize to me and do damage control. Story 46. Had an interview at a cafe bakery, and the guy kept going on how he has no idea why he has a high turnover rate, and kept talking in circles about the people who came to work for him, and kept quitting, and he needed someone like family and more committed to the job. He paid a bit higher than other places and had health insurance for employees. He hired me on the spot without any paperwork and didn't even let me think about the offer, just told me to show up the next Sunday. I didn't show, obviously, because the whole thing was a weird and desperate situation on his end. I already had a job, and he was saying that I need to quit it immediately to work for him. He kept blowing up my phone for 4 days after that. Bullet dodged, for sure. Story 47. I was in a first interview that had to ask if I would be okay working in an environment that would involve some woman employees. Would I have a problem working with or even being instructed by them? The fact that they would even have to ask tells me there's a harsh restructuring of the good old boy office underway. Dodge that dumpster fire. Story 48. I have different experiences. I had a company which was doing 3 interviews rounds, asking a lot of personal questions and trying to know my person. Once I started, no one was interested for me. I had no team, and finally, after complaining that I have no tasks, I was fired. On the other hand, I had another company which asked nothing about me and was not interested about anything in my life. Guess what? They gaslighted, mobbed, and made my life hell for a year. After quitting, they complained that they let me in a family-like atmosphere, and I leave them after a year. So what do? Instead of asking why, they overkill me with tasks and start asking for timesheets. Other colleagues sit around and do nothing. They can ask whatever they like. If they want to be a whole, they will be. Story 49. There are just so many red flags in the recruitment process, but one thing I've been noticing lately is particularly concerning for a remote position, when they ask you to complete a test that requires creating a long piece of content. I've experienced this twice, and afterward, the recruiter simply disappeared. I feel that some recruiters may be using this tactic to collect free ideas, so I've decided not to participate in these types of assessments anymore. Apart from this, other red flags include they make you wait for a long time, the office doesn't look good, and the people don't look happy. They are unfriendly in the interview. They ask you stupid questions like, how do you see yourself 5 years from now? Story 50. I went into an interview and they interviewed me for a position I didn't apply for and for a position I never worked prior but had lots of transferable skills in. Switching the offer during the interview, you applied for this, but we'd like you to do this. I accepted the position because I wasn't in a position not to be employed. Now I know better and to ask a lot more about positions I don't apply to. I could do the work, but I hated it, and there was zero training. Everything I learned in crisis at this role, which is why they offered it to me in the first place. High staff turnover in that position because it was awful. I lasted 7 months in the position and start my new job tomorrow, one with the actual position I applied for. Story 51. Had a hiring manager no-show for an interview twice at a big tech company. Both times I sat in the Teams meeting for 7 or 8 minutes before bailing. It was supposed to be for an internal promotion I was promised after exceeding my goals for the previous 18 months. Both times the guy wasn't even apologetic and just said he'd get back to me on a better day. I read the writing on the wall and found another job quickly in another industry. Turns out the funding for the position I was promised time and time again was cut, and then everyone in my department got laid off a few months later. I never once received a performance review in my brief venture into big tech. Made some dollars and got to work from home, but overall, it was a stupid and chaotic place to work. Story 52. On the first phone screening interview, they told me I was the perfect candidate for the position. Made me go through several other rounds of interviews. Then I had to wait weeks to hear back. When I finally heard back, they made me get references from my last 5 employers, some of whom I hadn't worked for since high school, including the employer I was currently working for, who didn't know I was applying to other jobs. My current employer was very busy and couldn't get back to them for a while, and they refused to give me an offer until they heard from my current employer in case there were red flags. Luckily, I got an offer from another place while I was waiting. They eventually did give me a tentative offer contingent on talking to my current employer, but I denied it. Story 53. I interviewed for a hotel as a second job. The listing was to be just part-time front desk to start. First issue, the interviewer was too busy to do my interview. When she finally had time, it was all complaining about how she had nobody to help her with anything. I never found out my duties, pay, benefits, or hours until I searched the company website after. The other issue is that she had half a dozen sleazy male workers doing nothing but trying to sleep with the female interviewees. It felt like a very sleazy PH casting call, with the boss being the only one unaware of what was going on, probably. The only other 2 people doing their job avoided the issue at front desk entirely. I recently went back after 4 months, and the whole staff was replaced, including the boss. Story 54. One phone interview was with the recruiter, and he told me I may have to work 1 weekend a month. I knew that meant 1 weekend off a month. The same company said they want you to be involved in the community while working 80+ hours a week. I had another for a contracting job. The guy interviewing me showed up late, and he asked me the first question, and then he just stops me and says, "Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to point out the safety exits." I stupidly stayed on to finish the interview because when you are unemployed, you can't really give up. The guy then told me at the end of the interview that I needed to become an expert in 4 different types of fields to be even considered for an entry-level contracting position. Story 55. During my first interview with this company, the interviewers were asking me about if I held any leadership roles in college or high school. I had completed a master's degree and had 3 years of job experience at that point, and even if I did hold any leadership positions in high school, it wouldn't be super relevant to my qualifications at that time. They also literally talked about the ping pong table at the office and how cool it was that the employees were young like them. I was 27 at that time and think they were a few years younger than me, so they were all friends and did happy hours all the time. I prefer to keep work and real life as separate as possible, so I was very okay with not getting further in the interview process. Story 56. I had when the interviewer never showed up. I still don't know why. HR were going to find out for me, but they never got back to me. It was a big company too, with plenty of job opportunities, but I'll never apply again. One guy said I waffled on too much. Strange thing was he offered me the job. I didn't take it. Another one asked if I had a partner. When I queried why and where I'm from, it's illegal to ask that. He told me people with partners don't work as hard as they always want to be, hanging out with them and not working. Dumb thing was, I was desperate for a job, and the guy who owned the company was a complete tool. He deserved to go broke. Story 57 interview. 1. Guy would constantly ask me what I wanted to do in life and getting curious about my goals. At first, I thought this was normal until he started asking if I'd leave if what I wanted came up and started getting super specific if I'd leave in a given time. Turns out the company had several problems with young ones leaving for various reasons and were getting desperate to keep anybody. Interview 2. The woman who was supposed to interview me ducked off in the first 2 minutes to go play chess and left it to a trainee employer who speed ran the interview in the first 10 minutes, to the point we were both just twiddling our thumbs and giving each other small talk for half an hour, hoping the woman would come back. Story 58. I asked the recruiter the dress code for the interview, and he said, "For you, it's business. For them, it's casual." I wore a skirt suit and they wore basketball shorts. I commented jokingly to the recruiter that based on the list of people interviewing me, I guess he needed a woman. He said he got a bonus for diversity hires. It was 12 men and me. Yada. 7 years later, I sued them, and it made the front page of the newspaper. Well, quote about someone said something about how my pussy was alienating people. My pussy did nothing of the sort. They just wanted to keep a boys' team. I did not flirt. I did not date. I just existed as a woman on a man's team. Story 59. I interviewed at a hardware store and was flat out told that as a woman, I would have to just put up with customers making lewd comments and harassment because it happens all the time. I did not take the job. My first job was at an ice cream shop and burger joint that had been open since 1962. I was told day one that he only hires girls, so they focus on helping customers and not impressing boys. He also violated labor laws in that state and would pay us under the table, but still take out our state taxes, which he pocketed. And I imagine how they stayed in business. since 1962. Story 60. Got interviewed at an events business by the owner's son. I was looking to leave a toxic workplace. So one of the questions I asked was, what was the office culture like? I told him that if we're selling, it's good, but if the sales team don't make their targets, you can imagine what it's like. Before wrapping the interview up, they asked me to send through a full marketing plan of what I would do to improve their business. I was young at the time, so didn't say anything, but after speaking to a mentor, I contacted them withdrawing my application. Glad I did, because years down the track, I met someone who worked there and my gut feeling was right. Apparently, it was awful. Story 61. HR and interviewer talked about different job position. HR posted job for process engineering and equipment sizing position. In phone, when we agreed for interview, this was still the case. But when interview started, the recruiting manager was talking about structural and equipment support, mechanical engineering role. The interview was disaster, as I tried to play along long as I could, but eventually I had to say, hold up, and ask what the situation is. Apparently, people in HR had no idea what difference there is between process flow and equipment sizing and equipment and their support structural engineering. This is why they should not hire people in HR without some sort of technical degree. So if company management is this level, what else is ducked up in there? Story 62. The lady told me about how employees can and should make comment cards about other employees when they do things we don't like so they can have meetings to solve the issues. She said, "It sounds like tattling, but it's not." Well, a little, but don't look at it like that. Do you have any questions? Yeah, can you tell me what my job would entail? Like I was ducking, shocked and grateful she dropped that comment card thing on my right away. Literally before anything, and even about the job I was applying for. Story 63. I had an interview at a coffee shop instead of the office, and they didn't want to call it an interview, but just getting to know each other. Should have been my first clue. Anyway, the first day I saw the office was on my first day. It was over a cigar shop, and my office smelled like cigars all day long, that it started giving me regular headaches. It looked like they had just moved in with lights not working, nothing hung on the walls. When I asked if they just moved in, they said no, they've been there for years. Ended up being one of the most toxic environments I ever worked. Story 64. Was interviewing for a position at a chemical plant. The plant had an explosion that killed a few people some years prior. The city itself was delightful. The employees were all right. The plant? Decrepit and rusting. The interview tactic was for 10 old white men to sit at a long table and fire questions at me. I was not seated at the table about 15 feet back. We got to the point where I was asked if I had any questions for them. 7 years ago, this plant had an explosion that killed 5 people and injured 15 more. Can you detail the safety changes that were made to ensure that does not happen again? I called my own cab to get back to the airport. Story 65. I interviewed for a daycare position, and they required you to come back the next day and basically volunteer 3 hours of your time to see if you would get the job or not. And during that time, they put on 2 different movies within 3 hours. Well, one was ending when I arrived. So they had been doing other activities, and then we went outside, maybe ate something, and then came back in. And their next activity was put on another movie, and one of the ladies yelled at me because I wasn't helping out, and I really wasn't sure what I was supposed to do in that moment, because everything was under control. Everybody was sitting down, getting ready to watch the movie. Story 66. It was more after the interview. The HR person called me 3 weeks after my last interview. Mind you, they said they were making a decision that same week of my interview, to ask if I was still interested and let me know they were going to extend an offer. Then she proceeded to inform me that the first month is through an agency. If they like my work, they will hire me directly. None of that was mentioned. Plus, them contacting me so late lead me to believe others have turned down that role due to that. I was probably their 3rd or 4th pick in line. I decided to decline and send them a thank you message. They never responded. Story 67. I had an interview with a hiring manager who asked me, if you quit in the first 6 months, what would the reason be? That caught me rather off guard as I was quite interested in the position. In my mind, I was thinking, I want to work for your company. Why are you already asking me why I would quit? The answer I gave was that I would only quit if I had a health scare or if the job was negatively affecting my health. This was a company with headquarters in East Asia. The hiring manager didn't seem to like Americans and said that Americans are lazy and don't have the work ethic for semiconductors. Looks like I dodged a bullet. Story 68. Went for a lead role and the manager wanted to pay me as a lead, but not make official. I was to follow the current lead for a while to pick up all I could, then they would fire her and then make me lead. Post manager, pause company. Story 69. I was in an interview as an entry engineer for a Japanese-based packaging company. They introduced one of the guys as the CEO of the whole company and another guy as the vice president of marketing. Both spoke broken English. The entire interview lasted 45 minutes, and there was no second interview. I knew the salary of the position and knew that no way you're bringing the CEO in for a Friday morning interview for a basic entry-level job. That job would have been something tough. I already had a job offer for a larger company, that was paying me 30% more than their offer. And no, this wasn't some 500-person employee small company, it was a 6,000-plus worldwide company. Story 70. There was a 3-panel interview, but 2 of the panelists were 15 minutes late. The first interviewer had me wait outside the conference room where workers were bringing biohazard hospital waste out to a big truck to be hauled off. It was cold and smelled horrible. When I got into the interview, the person who was the head of my department couldn't speak English well enough to communicate basic responsibilities of the position or understand my questions regarding career trajectory within the company. I'm in the healthcare field, so I'm not judging or upset that this person was still learning a new language. But miscommunication in the healthcare field can mean life or death in critical care scenarios. What happened during an interview that immediately made you realize you wouldn't take the job no matter how much they offered you? Story 1. I had a 3-hour interview where everyone on the interviewing team was friendly, enthusiastic, and making constant comments about, "You'd fit in well here, you're a gamer, we are too, we could organize some LAN games, XX, we really need someone with that experience." Then the C-levels came in. They feigned disinterest, had side conversations, and comments to me were all in the line of, "Maybe we'll go with you, maybe we'll just outsource, why don't you convince us? Maybe we should just take you on a contract basis to start until you prove yourself. Maybe we'll just hire 2 juniors for that salary you're asking for." While the team cringed, I cut them off saying, "It seems like you've got a great team here, but I'm not interested in working for hostile management." Then they completely changed their tune and were trying to backtrack. It was obviously their idea of salary negotiation. They called several times afterward asking me to come back in, but I wasn't having it. Surprise, the company was sold not long afterward, and I hear they cleaned house. Story 2. 3 of 4 people who interviewed me spent the entire time talking about how bad the company was and why I really don't want the job. The 4th was the CEO. His story was different. I didn't take the job. Story 3. When she started explaining that my role in handling payments would involve depositing client payments into my own personal account before transferring it to the company. I may be a git, but I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. Story 4. I was told the person I would be supporting as an executive assistant was on his 3rd wife. He has 6 kids, and that I should include the wife in certain decisions so that she doesn't feel insecure, being the 3rd wife and all. Isn't nobody got time for 3rd wife insecurity drama? Story 5. I tried getting a job as a telemarketer once. The interviewer had me go into another room and call her, and she would pretend to be a person I'm trying to get money from. I started into the script and she said, "Oh, but I'm just a poor college student with no money." Even though I knew she was just pretending, I still felt terrible. I knew that I could never do that work in real life. I told her that my coming there was a bad idea and I had to leave. Story 6. I interviewed for a job that was ostensibly a tech role, updating and maintaining the company's website. Midway through this hour-long interview, they asked me if I'm comfortable with sales because they said half the role would be cold calling customers and there'd be minimum monthly sales targets to meet. I am one of the most introverted people to ever introvert, so no, I would not be comfortable with that. I wouldn't have even applied for the job if they'd been at all explicit in the listing about it having a significant sales customer contact component. They didn't call me back, and I was relieved. Story 7 asked me if I would be willing to take a 3-month deferment while under a probationary period. If after 3 months they didn't like me, they'd let me go and give me a check for $0.10 on the dollar for every dollar HR worked. If they kept me, I'd get a check for all my hours, plus a bonus of $500 for office supplies, but I could only buy out of their selected catalog. I almost laughed in her face. Story 8. The interview was uneventful, except for at the very end when he asked, "Is there anything I need to know about you now before you start?" That would be a problem if it came out later. Me, entirely confused. Like what? "Oh, I don't know, if you have a criminal record, for example, or if you're gay." Story 9. Back when I was unemployed long-term, I was applying for roles anywhere I could find, really. Got an interview for a retail position. Not great, but better than nothing. First interview is a group 1. I get through that fine. Second interview is with the manager of the store. He spends like 10 minutes telling me how crap my resume is. Story 10. This was a grad school interview, so slightly different, but still fully convinced me to divert my focus to other programs and interviews completely. I was asked to prepare a 5-minute presentation that I would give via Zoom at the start of the interview. About a minute into the presentation, the interviewer got up and walked away from her laptop before returning about a minute later. She missed 20% of my presentation. I kept giving my presentation because there was also a student representative on the call, but the faculty interviewer neither apologized nor acknowledged leaving during my presentation. If I am not worth 5 minutes of your attention as a prospective student, then your program is not worth my tens of thousands of dollars. Luckily for me, I was accepted into my first choice program that same day. Story 11. The amount of lies discovered during the interview itself. They tell you one thing online and in emails, only to see something different when you show up and go through the interview. If there was already that much lying and falsehood seen during the interview, no telling how much worse it actually can be. Could understand why the person left. Story 12. I interviewed at a no excuses charter school. They gave a scenario where a student comes into class and doesn't have his homework done. He says it's because he spent the previous night in the ER because his brother was shot. School policies that unfinished homework is a mandatory detention. I could not, in good conscience, answer that question the way they wanted. Story 13. 1. He was looking for a personal assistant, and I don't even think he asked me my name, much less anything about qualifications. But he did sit next to me on the couch in his office, the only seating other than his desk chair, and told me I looked perfect and to come back tomorrow morning to start right away. I felt lucky to get out of there without being assaulted. Obviously never went back. 2. I was interviewing at a DR's office. The office manager was running late, and another tech was showing me around. She was casually telling me who sat here and who sat there and how long they had worked there. I quickly realized, in a staff of about 16 to 20, everyone, including the office manager I was about to meet, had been there less than 6 months. There's something causing a lot of turnover, and I don't need to know what. I asked the tech to apologize for me and said I couldn't wait. I had to pick my stepson up from soccer. Story 14. I went to interview for an entry-level marketing position in the film industry. 2 hours in, the boss slipped in that I wouldn't be paid for the first few months while they trained me. It was a full-time job. He also wanted me to start immediately that day, using my personal laptop. I made up an excuse and left shortly after. Story 15. My brother once had an interview for a cooking position at a local restaurant. He walked in and immediately ran into a female employee who was crying and yelling, "Duck you, John!" John was the guy who interviewed him. Story 16. One of the interview questions was, would I be willing to immediately fire a single mother who depended on the company Heath Insurance for her register being off 50 cents? Story 17. Had me wait for 2.5 hours while the guy that was supposed to interview me was in his office with a buddy, and they were laughing and probably drinking. I forgot to mention that the interview was a 2-minute conversation, and it went like this. Have you worked in a similar position before? Me. No, it's my first job. I've never worked anywhere. Well, we need people with experience, so we can't hire you. Story 18. I had an interview at a small law firm once with the owner. At the 10-min mark of sitting in a meeting room alone, I got up and started heading down the hallway to leave. Was met by the owner, never said sorry, just said that it was a busy day. Sat, talked. She explained that she wanted to upend LegalZoom by creating the same service and expand it slightly to encompass a couple of other items. Mind you, they have no tech people, and this was a small firm, very boutique. I stood up, shook her hand, told her good luck, hope she does well, and left the office promptly. Hilariously, I got an email 2 days later that they were moving forward with other candidates. Laughed. Story 19. Showed up and it's a mass interview of 25 people. MLM Ponzi scheme bullcrap. I have a bachelor's of science in psychology and sociology from FSU, which isn't very lucrative. For a while, I went through a plethora of crafty call center and marketing jobs. You find yourself at these awful interviews. Story 20. Not me, but this kid in my scout troop applied for a custodian job or something once. He said that the guy interviewing him was trying to subtly turn custodian into personal assistant. Some of the added tasks were to pick up Starbucks for his boss, drop off his dry cleaning, and work unpaid overtime to polish his desk. Story 21. It wasn't an interview but a taster session where I had to work there for 3 hours, then make my decision. A lot of the hardware didn't work. The guy training me was away and had to train me over a video call, so whenever anything went wrong, I was ducked and he would loudly sigh every time I needed something explaining. Because how dare someone need something explained to them on their first job? Story 22. It was a low-paying retail job, but I've been interviewed at the same time as someone else. The issue I had with this is that it pits two people against each other and it becomes incredibly awkward. I was interviewing against a woman who had lost her job and was talking about supporting her kids. I felt like I had to make a stronger case, saying that I didn't know how I'd afford college without the job. If an interviewer doesn't have time for 2 separate interviews, then just walk out, because things will only get worse. Story 23. When I was job hunting last, at one of the places I got an interview, the recruiter straight up lied to me about what the position was, and the posting on their site was vague enough that I was suspicious, but didn't catch it before the interview. It turned out that I wasn't qualified after all, so they didn't offer me the job, and of course it was very embarrassing. They wanted it a database admin, and my experience was essentially in desktop and below, so CUDA apps embedded and occasional kernel hacking. Even if they had though, The recruiter lying to you isn't a good sign. Their office was super gloomy too, although that was mostly the weather. Story 24. I was once told, "It is very important here to not let your morals get mixed up with doing good business." I took the job due to desperation, and man, was it a shady company. They started asking me to straight up lie to customers about their investments about 6 months in, and I was fired when they realized I was telling my clients the truth. The company ended up going bankrupt and getting several lawsuits against them. I gladly helped the DA with the most recent one, and am happy to say the company lost. Duck that company and their supposedly good Christian owners. Just to give a further idea of how crap this company was, they were partially an app development company and taking people's pretty large investments to do the apps while not actually having a team of people that made the apps. They were telling me to tell people it would be done soon when it hadn't even been started on yet. They were also an idea development company that took money from people with even the most harebrained crazy ideas. One woman had a vibrating vest, for instance. Another had a cane with Christmas lights on it, and promised they could get them into a ton of big box stores while not actually having any contacts in those stores, and simultaneously claiming they were amazing ideas. The company's founder was in various reputable magazines as a brilliant young up-and-coming CEO, and got the business featured on various fastest growing and most promising startup lists. When it got to the breaking point with the apps, they claimed hackers erased their main database with all the finished apps on it and did some interviews on the very real dangers of corporate hackers. They didn't even have a centralized database, nor the finished apps to store on one if they did. Story 25. I went for a job interview and aced it, knew I would get it as soon as I left. A few days later, I got called by the recruitment agency that advertised the job online and told me to go to their office to sign a contract. I headed up there and got this 10-page contract telling me that they will hold my pay and only pay me after they take a percentage every month. They may or may not also hold my pay for some other reason, should they deem fit. If you were to take sick leave during probation, etc., they said that the company I'm working for will hand my check to them and then they will pay me. I read it, said I need to go downstairs for a drink, and never came back. They called me for months, and I just ignored them. To think that there were people out there who signed these dumb things. Story 26. The interview was supposed to take place at a particular location of a chain store that was on the other side of the very large metro area I lived in. I received the address from them a few days before the interview, received no other contact or missed calls from them or anyone else in the days between, then drove 45 minutes across town. When I called the interviewer's number to ask where to meet, she told me that the address was a totally different location of the store, 40 minutes in a different direction. She told me that she'd emailed and called me to confirm this address. No, but she was at the location all day and was happy to wait. I didn't go. A phone interview for a job that had advertised itself as some sort of in-office customer service or clerical work. During the interview, the guy was super hyper and described the job as going into various people's houses and teaching them to cook a specific meal. I told him that isn't what I applied for and wouldn't be comfortable doing that because I don't even know what that means. He got super excited and pushy about why wouldn't I be comfortable doing that. I wouldn't need cooking skills, blah, blah, blah. I have to assume that it was some kind of mom thing that would have involved selling cookware. Because why else would random people need someone to do simple cooking demonstrations in their homes for only one meal? But at no point was any product or the word sales mentioned. I was like, yeah, no, and just hung up. Several times I've mentally checked out of the interview or phone call setting up an interview because the interviewer snapped at me for doing something wrong or questioned me aggressively for something mundane. The statement or the question itself was never an issue. But snapping at someone or getting aggressive before they're even your employee is just a red flag. Once, because my resume was backwards, it was, but snapping at me about it during the interview is less than necessary. Once, because I told them I couldn't come in for an interview on day X. Was it possible to come in on day Y? I was literally screamed at because, well, we are doing interviews on day X. I don't know what to tell you. If you can't come in on that day, I can't help you. You called me to offer me this interview. I didn't call you for help. If that schedule is unacceptable to you, then you can just say, unfortunately, we are only doing interviews on X day. We can't consider you otherwise, which is weird, but whatever. The most memorable, aggressive experience was when I went in for an interview for a busing position at a restaurant. The girl giving that interview said they'd filled the position, but they were holding interviews for hostesses the next day, and that I looked like a hostess. Whatever, I wasn't picky. So I came in the next day, and a different woman was there. I told her I was told to come today to interview for the hostess position, and she insisted that she had no idea what I was talking about. They were only interviewing for bussers, and what was I talking about? I just said that the girl from the previous day had suggested I come in for this, and the woman started shouting at me repeatedly to give her a name and that she'd never heard of who I was talking about. Yo, lady, I don't work here, so I don't know the name of some random chick with brown hair who was collecting resumes the day before. I have some theories as to what happened here, but nothing conclusive. I was 18 and didn't strictly need the job, so I just walked away after a while. Story 27. This was during a phone screen rather than an interview. Time frame was 1997, during the height of the dot-com boom. I'm a programmer. The screener told me that they were a fast-paced company, and I asked for some clarification on what exactly that meant. After some evasive answers, I asked more directly what kind of hours people worked and found out that many people were working 60-plus hours a week. I politely declined. The company did have an iPod in early 1999 that could have been lucrative for me, but I had an 18-month-old daughter and another on the way. I was changing jobs to be able to spend more time with them, not less. I feel very good about that decision. Story 28. I had a scheduled interview and was sent to wait upstairs at the executive level, and the woman who was to interview me had been called and told I was coming. I took a seat in front of her office window. I sat there for 45 minutes past my interview time. I almost left again and again because the whole setup seemed odd. She made me sit there, but never even stuck her head out the door to say I'm running a little behind or something to that effect. We did finally have the interview. I took the job because it was a really great job in a small, poor county. It was the worst job I've ever had. Ever. Turns out she was a complete nut. The entire staff was scared to death of her, from the yard guys that didn't even work in the building to every person that worked directly under her. No one would work upstairs on the executive level because of her. They all crammed themselves in the offices on the first floor and left that level empty to get away from her. People would confide in me because I had to work closely with her. They'd tell me, when I get out of a conversation with her, I feel like a crazy person. The woman who had my job before me had apparently quit after having sort of a mental breakdown. She treated employees like dirt and was the single most paranoid person I've ever run across. She thought people were breaking into her house to steal jewelry, with no sign but the missing jewelry, and also thought her daughter was lying to her about what books she needed to take a teacher's degree in college. She thought people were recording her phone calls as well. She refused to give employees training or instruction, so no one could ever say that she told them to do something that later turned out to be wrong. I was sat in my own office on the executive level and told to search a Word document for how to do the job. By the time I left, I'd be sick on Sundays thinking out going to work on Monday, and that's no way to live. I don't care how good the job is. Lesson is, if your gut tells you something is off in the interview, run. Story 29. They took issue with me, saying I wanted to watch my daughter grow up when they asked how much overtime I was willing to work. Yes, it was sarcastic, and I said it in a way I knew would torpedo the interview. I was insulted by the question. Story 30. The CEO of the company asked us, yes, it was a group interview, to make a vow. He said that every time we made a mistake, his accountants would calculate how much money our mistake cost the company. He asked for us to promise that any time this happened, we would voluntarily choose to pay the company for what they determined their lost revenue was. Story 31. I got through the interview and a day of training for a sales associate job in the handbag department of a big department store and was shadowing an employee before I got in the schedule. It was going pretty well. I like everyone I met, and the person I was shadowing, who would be my coworker in the department, was very sweet and helpful. But then I met the only other worker in that department. She was an older woman who, before I could even introduce myself, immediately started criticizing what I was wearing, how I was standing, and how I was smiling. Apparently my eyes were blank, my smile was dull, and I looked simple. Then just walked away. I was a little too shocked by her abruptness to respond right away and just stood there. The sweet coworker apologized, up and down for the other one's attitude, but the damage was done. I had a moment of pristine clarity and knew if I didn't leave now, I'd be stuck with that awful woman in a terrible job for years. I called the HR office the following day to explain the situation, and all they said was, if you quit over the phone, you'll be blacklisted and can never work at another department store, name again. I told them I was perfectly comfortable with that and hung up. It was a blessing in disguise, really. About 2 months later, I had a very nice, well-paying office job and heard that department store was laying off half its workforce. Story 32, production facility. Interviewing with plant manager for quality control position. Plant manager had another plant's quality manager sit in for the interview. Plant manager was super critical of everything I said. Bashed some of my training courses and credentials. They're super common trainings in my field, but the plant manager wanted more official training since he was a retired Navy officer who got all of his training through the government and not my globally recognized third-party credentials. The interview just kept getting more uncomfortable, and I kept wondering if this guy was just trying to make me leave. The other manager was super nice and asked questions related to my field and seemed really happy with my answers and credentials. It felt like good cop, bad cop. The quality manager ended up taking me on a tour of the facility. We talked candidly quite a bit. He was pretty sure I'd be offered something. I asked his opinion of the plant and the manager. He just replied with, well, you'd have to work with him every day. and gave me a knowing look. They offered me the position. I declined. The plant manager called me himself to let me know I wasted his time. This would have been a 40% increase in my pay. Most would call it life-changing, but my line of work is stressful enough without a Git plant manager breathing down my neck. I ended up finding a similar paying job that is virtually stress-free compared to my last job, and I couldn't be happier. I have since received many calls and emails about that position, and I have let the company know I have zero interest in working there. It's been over a year, and the position is still open. Wonder why? Story 33. The company had a system where if your application wasn't totally dog crap, you could send in an interview time out of a time window. I schedule my interview for something like 3 o'clock, so I arrive probably around 2:55 and I tell the host that I'm there for an interview. She runs to the back and comes back handing me a paper application and tells me I need to do that. All good, not a big deal. Even though I did one online, I hand it back to her and she says, the managers are busy, Aaron. Can you wait a minute or two for your interview? Again, all good. Got nothing else going on, I can wait. I end up waiting for 45 minutes. I should have left then, but listen, at my second ever job, I didn't really know better. Until a guy comes out to talk to me, and he's not even the ducking manager. There's 4 managers, and they couldn't get one to come talk to me for like 2 minutes. Anyway, there's more to this, so I talk to this guy and he's the head server. Super chill dude. He tells me if it were him, he'd be happy to hire me and if I can come in the next day at 2 to talk to the manager. I regrettably agree to come back the next day and the place is packed, 20 minutes wait for a table, and then whole lobby is full, so I'm not really expecting much. The manager comes out and she brings me to a table that has yet to even be bussed. Like, I know you're busy, but I'd rather be standing up than sitting at a table with a half-eaten burger in front of me. The interview lasts about 3 minutes, and she tells me to come back the next day for paperwork. I come back, and there's another girl there also waiting to start her onboarding. We waited for 30 minutes until the manager came out to do our paperwork, and I still work here to do this day. Honestly, really weird place, super weird, but I get like 15-hour plus tips for a he's job, so I'll take it. Story 34. I went to an interview at a car dealership. I didn't know anything about the business, but they seemed very nice and welcoming. They then tell me, the next part of the interview is a group thing. They walk me over to a door, and when it opens, it reveals a boardroom with a group of about 15 men. There were no females here whatsoever. This seemed odd, but I didn't know the business, so I went with it. This part of the interview lasted for over 2 hours. I didn't know that going in, and it was like I was sitting inside of an infomercial. There was this guy who was on stage telling us how great the place was to work and other things of this nature. At the end, they talked to everyone separately. They offered me a job as a car salesman, and they would put me through 6 weeks of training. I have to pay for the training, which came out to $600. As soon as my training was over, they would put me on the floor. For the next 30 days, I would be in training, their phrasing. And at the end of the 30 days, I would get my $600 back. I thought about it and told them I would be there bright and early tomorrow morning. I told my wife about it, and she was okay with it too. We really did not know any better. I walked up to the local gas station to get some cigarettes, and I was really happy. I finally had a job. The guy working at the station sees me all the time and is happy I'm happy. He asks why I'm happy, and I tell him. A trucker comes out out of nowhere and tells me not to do it. I ask why, and him and the gas station attendant tell me about how that place ducks people out of money all the time. What they were going to do is take my $600, and then 2 days before the date, they promised to give it back. They would fire me. They would then get to keep the money. Then the trucker says something I love by to this day and feel stupid for not realizing myself. He said, never pay a place for the opportunity to work there. The place called me for months, and I would duck with them every once in a while. I would tell them I would be there the next day and then not show up. Then they would call back threatening me over the phone for ducking with them, and they will never call me again. Then a few weeks later, they would call again, and the cycle would continue. I kinda missed it when they stopped calling. Story 35. After 2 panel interviews, was invited for a lunch with the team. I pretty much knew I had the job. The offer was just a formality by that point. Went to a random buffet restaurant at a forgettable hotel mile from the job site, which was really odd. Carpooled with the team, and it was a very weird vibe during the ride, and getting to the table, everyone was walking on eggshells around the manager, laughing too loudly at her jokes, etc. As soon as we sat down, the manager went up to get her food, and the rest of the team stayed at the table. When her phone started ringing, she'd left it on the table. They were panicking to be the first one to get it before the second ring. They were so deferential, almost comically so, and so worried about what might happen if the manager got upset, I just couldn't see myself working there. I turned down the offer when it did come in the next day. Saw the job advertised again a few months later, wasn't surprised. Always trust your gut. Story 36. I really had a strange interview yesterday, but it didn't put me off for the job. Before attending it, a coworker on another team told me she interviewed with the same dude for an entirely different position before accepting the position here. For context, dude is South Korean, about 10 years older than me, definitely ESL, and we are in the South. I moved here from Miami almost 4 years ago. He said that he's very competitive. I interpret that as his parents parented him hard on the path to success. He asked me where my name is from. It's Polish. Great-grandmother came over during World War II. He casually mentions Ukraine and their impending invasion. This grows into a cultural conversation, and if I feel any attachment to that, and if I've ever traveled to Poland, haven't. I push back onto him, and he says he's South Korean, and he goes back. This wasn't confrontational. It felt sherry, genial. He then asks me if I've traveled internationally. Yes, Canada, Iceland, Germany, Czech Republic, Austria, Colombia, Hungary, etc. We talk about that for a bit. He segues this into international work I've done and where I've worked. He works in that the company is owned by a parent company in the UK, and we will work heavily with our European contingent for materials and supplies stateside. He asked me if I'm okay with traveling for the position. Yes. I tell him I don't have any children, but I am married. He gave me what would you do hypothetical situations, which he called imagination questions, an ESL thing, but I knew what he meant. He asked me at what point I would notify him, to which I replied, when you needed to know, or when I resolved it. I think I convinced him I knew what I was doing because he seemed satisfied with my answers. He basically ended the interview by saying he sees me as a good fit for the position, but we need to interview again. He tells me I'm not like most Americans he's met. He follows that up by saying I'm definitely not like anyone here, the South. I'm sure you know what I mean. When I compared notes with my coworker this morning, she told me she didn't get the job. One of the reasons being he told her that he didn't like that she didn't travel internationally by choice. Story 37. The very first question was if I was comfortable with working long hours and often on the weekend. Separate your rate from your worth, always. Work to live, don't live to work. Story 38. He asked me if I was a crier because I looked like a crier. I was fresh out of law school and just told him I didn't think it would be a good fit when he offered me the job. If someone asked me that now, I would walk out of the interview. Story 39. I made a joke about being multilingual, but that Japanese wouldn't be useful for this job. There were near no Japanese speakers where the job was. The interviewer insisted I speak Japanese to this Chinese woman who was in the building to prove I could speak it. Then, when I refused because the lady was Chinese, he laughed and said he knew I was lying. I walked out. Story 40. I came from a gig as a junior developer. I interviewed for a developer role. I got in and their API was slow, their website basically a joke, and most of their reporting stuff was barely functional. I thought, wow, I can really have purpose here. Why does it feel like I'm overqualified for this role though? It's just basic programming stuff and no advanced math. They seemed super excited and I said, so what's the compensation range for this role? And their response was, this band can go up to $36,000 for the right candidate. And that made it all make sense. They never have had a developer because that's below entry-level rates. Story 41. I was hanging out with friends in a diner in Los Angeles one night way back in the early 90s when I was approached by a producer for MTV's The Real World. She said they were casting for the second season and invited me to audition. It sounded like it might be fun, so I said sure, why not, and proceeded to make it far into the process, through like 4 rounds of interviews, meeting the executives, etc. At first, all the questions were about my interests, my aspirations, my background, that sort of thing, but as it went along, all they wanted to know about was what sort of people I hated, who I could see myself in conflict with, what personality traits were most likely to make me angry. Suddenly, it didn't sound like a lark anymore. It sounded like a psychology experiment, and not in a fun way. So I said thanks, but no thanks, and noped out of there. It sounds naive in hindsight. It's reality TV, WTF, did I expect? But this was early days. If the same thing happened today, first I'd be flattered. Story 42. After I got my bachelor's degree in engineering, I interviewed for a position in a reliability lab. As part of the interview, one of the people I met with was a woman with a master's degree in the same field who I would be working alongside. In addition to talking with her, I got to see what she was doing, and between what I saw and what she told me, it was clear that the job they had her doing was way below her capability. For context, I had worked as a technician in the field while I was in college, and my tech job was both more challenging and had provided me a much greater amount of responsibility than what this woman, who was clearly very capable and had a master's degree, was doing. I certainly hadn't gotten my degree to take a downgrade in responsibility. The field I'm in is pretty small, and I later ended up working with some other people who had been at that company, and they all told me I made the right call. Story 43. I once had an interview where I spent the majority of the day there. They took me around and introduced me to everyone, about 30-ish people, had a group lunch, etc. While everyone was very nice and the work seemed interesting, I noticed everyone looked very tired. At one point during the day, I was making small talk with a manager, and the topic of travel came up. He then mentioned it had been years since he last took a vacation. After some questioning, I soon gathered that not taking vacations was pretty common there. I happened to run into the same manager about a year later, and he was happy to report that while he hadn't taken a vacation yet, he actually had one booked. He still looked exhausted. Story 44. Not the interview, but orientation. I sat down with the young woman, and she just sighed and shrugged and said, "Look, I'm quitting by the end of the week. My boyfriend now makes enough money for me to be a stay-at-home mom. I don't care. Do you care? I don't really care. We're just gonna watch the video and we'll just kind of hang out. Sound good? Great. I'll be back." She then waddled over to press play on the company video and left me there for almost an hour. I declined the job and left. Story 45. During the start of the pandemic, was at a second interview, was a lunch meeting to meet the team, and they mentioned how the coronavirus, one of them had caused them to take their last 2 weeks of vacation so they couldn't get it again. Said they would be sad to have to let their 5-year veteran go, but it was company policy. Guy was at the table with us. I asked, well, if they contracted it without vacation time, couldn't they just take unpaid time off or work from home as it was? It'd work. And they assured me that despite him being the only one they had for his role, they would have to terminate him if he had no sick or vacation time left and came down with corona. At the time, it was 2-week required quarantine. I even verified what if someone took off their vacation for like Christmas and got sick in January before their system gave them time back for next year, and they were 100% serious. And it was the reason for some of their recent turnaround in it, people. Spoke with that worker after, and he said he has been with the company for 5 or more years and never had missed days, but was worried they could drop him at any time for situations beyond his control. Story 46. I was interviewing at a nationally known survey company back in the early 90s. I was a database administrator, and they were planning on migrating their data from flat files to a database. The last guy I interviewed with would have been my direct supervisor. One of the things he said in the interview was that he didn't think they really needed a database. Database administrators were in short supply back then, and you could essentially write your own ticket. There was no way I was going to waste time trying to work with someone who would fight the very concept of my job description. Story 47. When applying for a sales position, the interviewer, and the would-have-been boss, told me that the thing about doing sales on the phone is if you can make the customer say yes to pretty much anything, you can push the sale through. I responded a haphazard, "Oh yeah, for sure," while I immediately knew I wouldn't work an hour in that company for the life of me. In previous sales jobs, I had always encountered the "you can't trust a salesperson" trope, and I knew it was guys like him and companies like his who keep that stereotype still alive. Spent 15-20 minutes more in the interview just toying around, asking questions to try and get him to spill something else equally as controversial or stupid, either on purpose or by accident, but to no avail. Guess he pulled back a bit after my reaction, because the worst thing was not what he said, but the look he gave me when he said it. It was like a wink without one, almost as to say, just so you know, if ethics and morality aren't your thing, you'll fit right in and make a bunch of money. Gets Story 48, a no harm, no foul approach to child protection. I was interviewing for a teaching job, arrived at the school, said why I was there, and before I even gave my name, they waved me through, past the locked doors and into a waiting room. Nobody asked for my name, DBS or ID, and within 10 minutes, I was on my own with 2 children being given a tour of the school, which included parts of the grounds that were pretty far out of sight of the building. The interview date was posted on the job listing online, so literally anyone with internet access could have found out the school was hosting interviews that day. They hadn't taken a single step to check I wasn't a convicted. When I expressed my concerns upon meeting actual members of leadership, they then asked my name and to see my DBS, then said, well, they should have checked, but it's all fine, isn't it? I left. Story 49. Back in 2008, I saw a posting on Craigslist for a writing job. During the interview, it became clear to me that the actual job was to create and maintain hundreds of fake email accounts and post fake reviews for products I never used. I hadn't heard of this concept before. Hey, it was 2008. So I just chuckled at one point and blurted out, "Isn't that illegal though?" Thankfully, I never heard back from them. Story 50. The day of my interview, I don't get a call at the time I'm expecting. Okay, no big deal. Maybe something happened and they're running a little late. After 10 minutes, I decide to give them a call. And the office manager that scheduled the meeting said she didn't know what was wrong and why he hasn't called. So she asked if would be around a bit so she could figure it out. I said sure, and 30 minutes later, I get a call from the guy saying sorry, but there was an emergency and if we could reschedule for 5 p.m. I said that was fine, but 5 p.m. comes and passes and I don't get a call. The next morning at around 9 a.m., he calls back, apologized again, and asked if we could do our interview now or if I wanted to reschedule. I didn't have anything going on, so I said now is okay. As we're doing the interview, he's eating his breakfast, so I have to listen to that, and then On top of that, because I was on speakerphone, I could also hear his phone vibrating constantly with alerts. The whole thing was such a bad experience that even if they had offered me a job, I would not want to work there. Story 51. Back in 1996, I was looking for a job in the well drilling industry. Not the highest paying jobs, and I was a greenhorn, but I could run anything and learn things quick. I saw a job offer in a publication about a job for $250K a year. Remember, this is 1996. Obviously, I looked into this. I went through the vetting process. Have you worked in the drilling industry? Do you have a class, a license? Or... After a week or so of phone calls after work, I finally get an in-person interview. Great. Well, I show up in jeans and a t-shirt because that's how drillers dress. We don't wear suits or get fancy haircuts. I sit down with the drilling supervisor and talk to him at length about tools and the rigs I've worked on. Everything seems to be going well. The regional manager shows up and decides to sit in on the interview. After a few minutes, he asks me, "How are you with gunfire?" I didn't know what to say. I told him I own guns and I like to shoot recreationally. That was when it was explained that the job would require me to go to Saudi Arabia to drill wells. When they people over there blew up the wellheads, I basically necessitate a new "will be drilled." Apparently, we would be behind bulletproof glass on the rigs and only travel with the security squad back and forth to the hotel. Wouldn't be allowed to go out and walk around. Under armed guard the whole time. The payoff was $250K after taxes for a 1-year contract. I politely declined. I think I smoked like 2 packs of cigarettes on the 2-hour drive home because I was so shaken. Story 52. I'm from Brazil. Important because taxation in Brazil is crazy, and I was applying for a job abroad. At the last step of the interview, I asked how I would be paid while I worked from Brazil. Since it was early 2021, most flights to Europe weren't accepting Brazilians. They tell me that the Brazilian who was working for them was not in a position where they'd like to put me, as he would either pay 2x income tax, once in the company's country and once in ours, or I wouldn't get paid until I moved. Some I know the other employee they were talking about. I know that he would not have minded having the pay withheld. So that is not what made me quit. The problem was their solution. You could set yourself as a micro company, have no work rights, pay even more tax, need to pay for an accountant, and then send invoices to them to get paid. Also, with hindsight, it would have taken longer to set up as a micro company than it would have to be able to travel there. Interesting to see that it is very easy to do in different places. In Brazil, it'd cost a lot and take forever, and I know the company didn't say this in bad faith. It did look like a nice place to work. I just booked it because it was not feasible in my situation. Story 53. Okay, this is a doozy. Recently graduated, applied for a gaming company, one of the few in the country. Big city, big company. The recruiter was nice, explained the process in detail, and since they were looking for different roles that I might fit, she asked if I was okay in taking a technical test with 2 of the leads. Cool. FFWD to the day. We had only an hour and a half scheduled. The whole time, the 2 interviewers kept talking between themselves about an upcoming convention, basically asking just a couple of questions and nothing more. I was a bit annoyed, but it was GDS, and I get it's a big deal, so I did not mind too much. Then I got an interview with a senior manager, and oh boy, he was trying to lowball me so frickin' bad that I still remember his words. He was offering a ridiculously low salary in one of the priciest cities. He said, and I quote, "You will start at 20K, in about 2 years we can reach 22K, and after another couple we may think of 25K, and proceeded to draw a ducking graph of the salary years. I was extremely surprised, and it showed because he added, "I know it starts low, but just rent an apartment with another 4 or 5 people, and it will be fine." Oh, he also asked if I was in a relationship and if I wanted to get married and have children, which is pretty illegal. Story 54. Sales for a life insurance company. Great pay, hot leads. Like shooting fish in a barrel. That's because the unions feed them their rosters, and the insurance company contacts the workers as if they're officially representing the union. The pitch was worked out to a science. Most workers agreed but didn't really understand the terms of the insurance. It didn't cover everything, and there were circumstances where the survivors would have a hard time collecting the benefit. The insurance company was not afraid of getting in trouble because the union bosses were in on it. The whole thing was disgusting and made my skin crawl. People were being preyed upon by the people who were supposed to protect their interests. Story 55. When I was looking for a job as an engineer, I interviewed with an HR person that was into adverse interviews. So after I'd been shown around by someone else, he interviewed me. He pretended to have not read my resume. He seemed disinterested. He was just very negative. So when that interview concluded, I assumed that either they were not interested in me or didn't have a position that I would. I interviewed with a couple of other companies and was offered jobs everywhere I interviewed. I accepted the job that sounded like I would enjoy the most. I got 5 raises my first year as well as a bonus. After I had accepted my job offer, the first company called me back. It was a different person, and they said they were very interested in me. I told them about the interview and that the impression I got was they were not interested. The person that called me was very upset, saying that they had a perfect position for me with my qualifications, etc., etc. I let them know politely that the HR person was very negative towards me, and I assumed that there would not be a good fit at the company. The person who called me said, "That idiot. He took that latest seminar in interview techniques and that I'd passed with flying colors and that they really wanted me." I let them know that I'd accepted a position with one of their rivals and that perhaps they needed new interview techniques if they really wanted to hire people. Story 56. The first 30 minutes of the interview was the woman who would have been my boss listing off her accomplishments. She was the director of a tiny museum in a small town where we had just moved to for my wife's job. It was uncomfortable, and the 2 board members present looked even more uncomfortable than I was. I don't know if she was intimidated by me, I was more qualified to work there than she was, or if she just liked singing her own praise. But I immediately thought, you couldn't pay me enough to work for you. After her 30 minutes of self-congratulations, there was approximately half a minute of silence. Then I looked at the 2 board members and said, "Right, were there any questions for me?" I was called that night and offered the position. I turned it down. One of the board members who was present called and asked if there was anything they could do to get me to come on. Pay was negotiable, within reason for a tiny museum in a tiny town. I was candid and said I would never be able to work for that director. Board member said, "Believe me, I completely understand." Story 57. This happens in Singapore, where somehow there's a perception of foreigners taking up entry-level jobs at less than the market rate with their incredible grit to get a job. But the reality is that many of these foreigners are either exploited or only work for a few years so that they can put on resume they worked overseas, and the most likely yet somehow tolerated issue is the language barrier is terribly significant, as many learned English in books, but never practiced speaking or actually using it outside of classrooms. So, after everything going well, I have more than once gotten this question from interviewers. Why should I hire you when another person from China, Myanmar, Malaysia, etc. can do the same job for lesser pay? So just to be clear, the question is meant to hustle the person to either take up a lower pay than the advertised one, or sign a blank check for extra work responsibilities, or in worst cases, both. After the second or third time, I made it a point to tell these employers or interviewers as politely as possible that they should have just hired these foreigners instead of interviewing me, thank them for the time, and walk away. Story 58. I was having a second phone screen with the hiring manager and one of his directs. It was for a software firm. I think it was a CRM company, if I recall. I work in it, not a developer or anything like that. Anyway, I familiarized myself with their products and such in case it came up, etc. Interviews ahead kind of rocky. And very good at what I do, but they kept second-guessing everything I'd say. Why would you do it like that? Or wouldn't you rather? Anyway, so they asked me what my favorite feature of their software is, and I'm honest with them that I haven't used their software, but I've familiarized myself with what they offer. Abs, they cut me off and start giving me the business, asking me why I bothered applying there, if I haven't used their software before, and why I would want to work for a company whose software I don't use, like being very aggressive about it. I was dumbfounded for a minute and just said, "Thanks for your time, but I really don't think this is going to be a good fit for me," and I hung up. I've seen them hiring for that same position almost constantly for years now. That was about 5 or 6 years ago. Story 59. When I was interviewing for engineering internships in college, I had an interview with a city department that handled road repair projects. One of the interviewers asked if I knew Spanish, which I know a little, and then in the next breath asked, "Would you feel comfortable giving instructions and keeping the field crews in line? They're like managing children." Whether or not he intended to equate Hispanic construction workers as children, I can't really say. But the question definitely rubbed me the wrong way, and I declined the position a week later when they offered it to me. Story 60. The managing partner, attorney, interviewing me for a paralegal position noted that I have a paralegal degree and said, "I don't care about that. I think it's a bullcrap degree." Proceeded to brag about how he designed the office. Ghosted me, which I assume means he hired someone else, and called me a month later with an offer when they didn't work out. Too many red flags for me.